Hey, what is up, guys? Welcome to Thursday's edition of Where All the Ladies At. This is a podcast where I take a deep dive into history and sometimes myth and legend and try to figure out where all the fuck the women went, because for being half of the population, only a handful of us made it into the history books, and that seems very fishy. Seems almost like there might be someone out there keeping some of this history secret. And no, I'm not talking about the Illuminati. I'm not into that kind of stuff. Not that I don't think that maybe they're real, but I'm talking more about the patriarchy. Yes. And if you're asking who the fuck you are, or who the fuck I am, maybe you're asking who the fuck you are too. We all ask that question at some point. I am Kim, and I am your host, and I am a history nerd. I am a writer. I am a feminist. I'm just a human being trying to make it in this garbage fire of a world right now. I know that sounds very pessimistic, but right now that's kind of how I feel, to be truthful. There's a lot of stuff going on that is not great. And it's not only in my home country, it's pretty much across the globe. Yeah. So, anyways, speaking of my home country, back in the day, just last month, we had this holiday called Black History Month. And I don't care who says it's not real and doesn't think we should celebrate it. I'm celebrating it because Black history is American history. And for those guys of you that's not from the U.S., I know that this is a very U.S.-centric thing, but I think the stories need to be heard, and nobody's going to tell me that we can't celebrate them. And that's just kind of how I am. I tried for a long time, for the first couple of seasons of this podcast, to not get real political. There'd be occasionally a snap thing, but now I've said, well, too bad. Now it's going to happen a lot, because I don't think I can talk about the women and the history I'm going to be talking about without maybe getting a little political, because now someone, or some people, because it's not just him, there's a lot of people around, are making it a necessity for us to speak up and use our voice. And not that we shouldn't have done it before, but now it's even more important. So my voice matters, and because I run a podcast that talks about women in history, I feel a even bigger call to tell these stories, because I'm afraid that stories are going, and histories are going to start being erased, or at least made so that you're not allowed to really talk about it. It's a fear that I have. So I'm going to tell as many stories as I can, and I'm going to share as much as I possibly can. And this is Black History Month, and this is the last episode of Black History Month, and I'm very sad. And yes, I know their stories should be celebrated all year round, but I want to keep focusing on different people and different women, and so one of the best ways to do that is to chunk it out. And so this month was all about Black History Month, and I've covered some amazing women, and on my Myth podcast I've covered some really cool African goddesses. History-wise, I've covered Sister Rosetta Tharpe, I've covered Madam C.J. Walker, Josephine Baker, and today I'm covering Ida B. Wells, who is even more poignant now because she is a journalist, and I feel like journalists are on the chopping block in a lot of places as well. So, that being said, also, I am all in for the fight. So next month we are celebrating Women's History Month. Even, once again, if someone tells us it's not a real holiday and that we shouldn't celebrate it, I say, yeah, I'm trying not to cuss, guys. So next month we are covering Women's History Month, and next month for the myth portion of this podcast, we'll be covering sun goddesses, which is something that's not talked about a lot, and I thought it was really cool. and I found some really awesome sun goddesses. And then as for the history portion, we're going to be covering kind of a dual nature. We're going to be covering some female philosophers. Hannah Arendt is one of them. And then we're also going to cover women who stood up against fascism. And one of the ladies we're going to be talking about that in that portion of the Women's History Month is Dorothy Thompson. So some amazing ladies, and I cannot wait to talk about them. But I'm not going to jump the gun because the lady I'm talking about today is equally as badass. So before we get started, though, as usual, if you want to contact me, you want to support the podcast, you want to learn more about these ladies and other subjects, there are links to my social media, to my Buy Me a Coffee and Patreon, as well as the Medium publication that goes along with this. There is also a link to my other podcast called Our Mystic Road Trip, and that is a magical, mystical, spiritual wellness podcast. So if that's something you're into, make sure you check it out. Today, in this day and age, I think we all could use a little meditation and some magic, mystical, and spiritual assistance. And so, what else? Yeah, and if you want to support the podcast, but you can't do it financially, I completely understand. I mean, for those of you in the U.S., if you need to afford eggs, you can't be giving me money. So, and that's perfectly acceptable. But if you would like, review, share, rate, follow, shout it from the rooftops, tell everybody about where all the ladies at, that would be much appreciated, because I do think these stories need to get to more people. Yeah, I do think so. And that's it for my shameless plugging and my little housekeeping. So now we can get talking. Ida B. Wells. All right, so per the usual, before we jump into the lady herself, we're going to talk about what it was like, where she grew up, when she grew up, and what was going on at the time. All right, so first, let's talk about it. Mississippi. In the middle of a dry spell. Sorry. My mind, right? In the late 1800s and early 1900s. So, here's the thing. Mississippi in the late 1800s was not a really welcoming place. Much like most of the South, after the Civil War ended, it became kind of a battleground. It was this battleground, especially when it came to the rights of Black people and for the vision of what the new America was really going to look like post-slavery, right? Reconstruction was supposed to offer new beginnings with the 13th, the 14th, and the 15th Amendments. But also on top of that, the Emancipation Proclamation, citizenship for the freed slaves, and also giving Black men, not women, the right to vote. It was supposed to be this era of hope. But, especially in some states in the South, particularly in like Mississippi, Alabama, those places, these new ideas weren't really taking hold, because it was kind of like people were trying to plant a seed in like a drought, and it just wasn't happening. Some southern states did try to make reforms, but most of them very quickly found ways to avoid the spirit of the Reconstruction. And they did that by enacting laws that, even though the Black people were given their freedom, kept them enslaved. It kept them from enjoying the freedoms that they had just gained. These were... the first group came in 1870s. These were called Black Codes. They were laws that limited Black people. Basically, every law was structured to make Blacks in the South, particularly Mississippi, in this situation, second-class citizens. for instance, a lot of them were forced into labor contracts with former enslavers. And often this was done under the threat of arrest. Like, it's like, you do it or you go to jail, your choice. So even when free, the black people still couldn't own land. They were pushed into a system of sharecropping, and that kept them tied to land in ways that wasn't really much different than slavery. And then came the Jim Crow laws. By the late 19th century, these laws basically institutionalized racial segregation in public spaces, and it turned pretty much all the southern states, because the Jim Crow was not just in Mississippi, into this beautiful, abundant land for white supremacists. Schools, restaurants, hotels, restrooms, water fountains, all segregated, right? Black people were treated as though they didn't belong in the same places, and the rules that governed everyday life were to make sure everyone knew their place. But segregation was a little bit more than just about dividing public spaces. They really were, the concept was really made to show the black people who held the power. They were built to maintain white dominance and to send that powerful message. Black people, no matter how free they were on paper, were still not equal to white people. These laws were tools of oppression. And the terror that came with the Jim Crow laws was definitely not subtle. Mississippi, along with other southern states, became a pretty violent place. And all that violence seemed to be directed at black people. Sadly, one of the things that was most common at this time was lynchings, and this was used, this tactic, this terrorist action, I will call it, was aimed to keep black communities in check. This was a time when black people, especially black men, could be accused pretty much of anything, from looking at a white woman wrong, to simply being too outspoken or successful. And no matter if they were guilty or not, what in the end, what the ultimate goal for those laws was to intimidate and maintain control. Lynchings. Sorry guys, that's a good chunk of my family comes from the South, and it's not a piece of history that's very I don't know, not very happy with that. It's not, it's kind of like the fact that, part of my family is German, so the things that happened in World War II, even though my family had already left, it's still pretty emotional. So lynchings were public hangings, and black people would be dragged out of their home in the middle of the night sometimes, and tied to a tree, and then murdered in front of a crowd. And then the bodies would just be left there, and sometimes mutilated as a symbol that, don't do this or this will happen to you. And it wasn't like these things were hidden in the shadows. It was done right out in the front of everybody. And not that being hidden in the shadows would have been any better, but like the nerve and the audacity of these people to do this in public, just murder somebody in public. Like, people would come from miles around to see this disgusting acts. I don't know. And the authorities, well, they didn't do anything, The police, in some cases, the courts, they were all complicit in this. You know, they would, and if they didn't participate in those crimes, they pretended like they didn't see it. You know, and in this situation, if there was any type of investigation, it was often nothing more than like a cover-up to justify it. Oh, we're gonna find the person who did this, and then they would do it for a little bit and make it look like they were doing something, and then it would come up nothing. Right? White supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan were entrenched in law enforcement. Many of the sheriffs and the police officers were members of the Klan. And that meant that they had, basically, the men that did this had law enforcement in their back pocket, right? Mississippi wasn't just a place with racial segregation, right? It was really a terrible place at this time, especially for Black people. Black people were living in constant fear. They knew that anything they did could potentially cost them their lives. That, I can't even imagine, right? I can't imagine what that's like. The physical and emotional toll and the mental toll had to have been huge, right? But here's the thing. In those type of areas that have so much oppression and so much violence, one thing comes out of there, and that is resistance, right? So in the face of all this injustice, there were a huge amount of Black individuals, both men and women, including Ida B. Wells, that really spoke up and fought the systematic violence and fought the systematic discrimination. It was a long road, and it is not done. And we had made progress, but I'm telling you right now, that progress, I think we've taken 10 steps backwards after only moving 8 steps forward. What's going on right now in the U.S., we haven't made as much progress as we thought, I think. So, the end to that piece of the story, though, would take decades to finally get out. And this is where Ida B. Wells was raised, right? So what was life like for women in Mississippi, right? It wasn't a walk in the park. It wasn't. We've talked about this era in a couple other podcasts, and it wasn't great. It was restrictive for women in general, but for Black women even more so, right? If you were a woman in this state, you pretty much were expected to stay home. You were cook, clean, raise babies, and if you were lucky, you had a nice husband. And if you're lucky, you got to choose your husband, right? It was a time when women weren't encouraged to have big dreams. Careers? No way. Education? Fuck that, right? The idea of a woman taking control of her own life and forging her own path was not common, right? And for Black women, especially in Mississippi, it was brutal. It wasn't just difficult, like for all women. It was brutal, right? Black women had to work exhausting hours in the field, toil away hard labor, and then they didn't get paid well, and they didn't get any kudos for it either. It wasn't glamorous in any such of the imagination, but it was work, and you do what you have to do to survive. Along with that, Black women often worked as domestic servants, cleaning houses and caring for children of white family. There they worked long hours too, and grueling hours for terrible pay, and often were pretty much treated poorly. In some cases, it led to, assault. So that wasn't great, Even though they were working in this place, they were made to feel they didn't even belong in the same space as these families. The respect they were given was not existent. And opportunities for a better life, that was slim to none. They were pretty much cornered into a cycle of poverty and racial discrimination. But they were strong, right? And they pushed back against the system. It's really important to note that this period wasn't just about economic struggle. It was about the lack of autonomy. Let me repeat that sentence. It wasn't about economic struggle completely. It was also about the lack of autonomy. Women, in general, but black women did not have hardly any rights. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own their own property. They couldn't make decisions for their own lives, right? They were second-class citizens in a system that was built to keep pushing them down. So what do you do with that? Education? No way. Black children, schools were underfunded and overcrowded. And the idea of attending a school that offered a decent education was a dream at best, right? Very few black girls in Mississippi ever got the chance to finish even elementary school. And going to college? No way. The idea of a black girl going to college was something you'd only see in stories, but there were also those who refused to accept the status quo. And Ida B. Wells was one of them. Despite limited opportunities, Wells really refused to accept boundaries set for her. So we'll talk more about her in a little bit. She really, the odds were stacked against women in general, but black women, it was even worse, But there were some women that pushed those barriers, right? And claimed their place in history. And that's where we get to talk about Ida B. Wells, right? There was a lot there. All right, so Ida was born in 1862 in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She was the oldest of 8 children. And her parents, though former slaves, were determined to make sure that their kids had all the opportunities they possibly get, right? They advocated for education and civil rights in their community. They were activists. And this, I do think, is where Ida may have started to get that fire, right? Because to be an activist, to get out there and stand up and use your voice and put your life on the line, because that's what she was doing. And by the way, a lot of these women I've talked about, that's what they do every time they choose to break the mold, to stand up against, what society says they should be. And so I think the fact her parents were activists probably really, hit her in there, right? Her early life wasn't easy, right? In 1878, she was just 16, and both of her parents, along with her younger brother, died from yellow fever. And so now Ida didn't have any parents. She was the head of the household. She was responsible for raising her 5 siblings. And that's a lot for anyone to handle. But if you add the fact she was a teenager and the pressure of what was going on in the world, that's a lot. But you know what? Instead of crumbling into a ball, and I'm sure she had her moments, let's just be real, right? Even the strongest women have their moments. But instead of just crumbling, she stepped up and she got to work and she figured out what she had to do. She found a teaching job, and that allowed her to support her family. She was stepping into the role of leadership and responsibility at an age where she shouldn't have had to, but unfortunately, tragedy does what it does, right? Uh, when she reached into her 20s, she moved to Memphis, and there she became more involved in the Black community and really started making waves as a journalist. It was here she began her career, and she started reading for this thing called Free Speech and Headlight. It was a newspaper based in Memphis that was pretty much addressed. No, it wasn't pretty much. It was addressed at issuing issues facing the Black people in the South. But she didn't want to just write the fluff pieces, right, about local events. That didn't really interest her, right? So she decided to use her platform to expose the ugly truth about systematic racism, discrimination, and the violence that her people were facing every single day. Every single day. Right? But in 1892, 3 of her friends, Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, and Henry Stewart, they were all lynched by a white mob in Memphis. And the men had owned a pretty successful grocery store, and they were defending, they defended it from a white competitor, and that led to a little bit of a public outcry. And a mob of white men decided to take justice into their own hands. They didn't just kill these men, though. They tortured them. They hung them publicly. And they used brutal acts as a spectacle for the entire town to witness. And this tragedy for Ida, it was kind of a wake-up call. She was already wanting to fight against these things. She was heartbroken, but she was furious too. And she realized she just couldn't sit back and let this atrocity stand unchallenged. It just wasn't who she was. So she began writing a series of articles where she investigated the crime. And in doing so, she uncovered a lot of lies, false statements, false justifications about the lynching. And she wasn't afraid to express it. Well, she was probably afraid, but she was a strong woman. So she was out there exposing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it made her and other people feel. These articles set the stage for a larger investigation into the lynching epidemic in the South. But Ida didn't just write about injustices, though. She went beyond the page. She took her campaign on the road. She traveled across the United States, even abroad, to raise awareness about the violence Black people were enduring in the South. Her speeches and writings sparked a lot of conversation, even in Europe, right? When she went to Europe, so many Europeans were so shocked by the brutality she described. She actually became a pretty big national figure, known not just for her journalism, but for her courage of speaking out about race and civil rights. Of course, her activism really didn't win her any popularity in the South, right? In fact, it made her a lot of enemies. The Free Speech Office was destroyed by a mob, and Ida received threats on her life. She had to leave Memphis just for her own safety, but that didn't stop her. Ida was pretty driven to make sure that justice, was had, and nothing was going to get her down, right? She really continued her work. She wrote and spoke about rights of Black people and women. What's really remarkable about Ida B is her courage to face that danger. But also her persistence. Even after facing all of these hardships, even after running out of her home, and she didn't give up. She kept fighting, and that is, she used a pen and her voice, and that took her well beyond the borders of the South. She was a trailblazer for civil rights activism. Her work shed light on lynchings, yes, but it sparked movements and inspired generations of activists. She showed the world that journalism could be more than just reporting. It could be a tool for justice. And she showed the world that women, especially Black women, could have a profound impact on history. She was amazing. And honestly, I think it's very poignant that I'm talking about her right now, because there's so much we have so much access to media, and there are some very reputable and very honest journalists. But there's also those that just want the click, right? So I implore you guys that for news to get out there and try to find your Ida B. Wells. They're out there. There's a lot of great journalists out there, and a lot of great media groups, media podcasts, media channels, media, all these things. But find the ones that are reputable and not bought. I think that's where the hardest one. Find your Ida B. Wells, the ones that are going to stand up for justice no matter what happens to them. Those are the journalists that are really amazing. All right, so Ida B. Wells changed the world. She had fearlessness, right? In 1893, Ida actually published a book called Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. And this was a groundbreaking piece of journalism. Before she got into the lynching things, a lot of the times when these crimes were talked about in media, it was talked about as justified. Like, these guys were bad people. They did this. They deserved what they got. But Ida really dug deep and really, really revealed that sinister reality. So, in her writings, Ida went deeper than those sensationalized headlines. There was a growing trend of lynching, and there was patterns of extrajudicial violence, and it wasn't random. It was systematic. Whether a black man was accused of a crime or not didn't matter, right? She made it clear that the real purpose of lynching was to maintain a racial hierarchy, and that was that simple. She took direct action, though. She did a lot of stuff. Beyond working with lynching, was an ardent advocate for women's suffrage, and this is something that was kind of interesting because she did fight for women's rights, but it was this weird thing where a lot of the women suffragettes, the white women suffragettes, still looked at black women as lesser than, and didn't see that they had a lot of the same, not all of the same, but a lot of the same fights. And that was sad. So, she believed that in order for black women to be equal, they needed a chance to vote. It was that simple. She also found the Alpha Suffrage Club in Chicago, and that became one of the first black women's suffrage organization in the country. And it was very pivotal in mobilizing the black women to fight for the right to vote. Like I said, there was discrimination even from the white suffragists. They sidelined the black women. But Ida said, no, I don't think so. And so she forced them out, and she got the black women out there in the front, right? It didn't stop at suffragettes. She committed to fight women's dignity, protection, empowerment. She included combating the pervasive violence against black women. She wanted to, she just wanted a seat at the table for everybody, but particularly for the black women. And as right as she should have fought for her spot at the table. But instead of doing that, she said, you know what, I'm just going to build a table for myself. So there's that, She actually played a very pivotal role also in the founding of the NAACP in 1909. Ida was one of the founding members, and this was a group of activists. Like, if you don't know what the NAACP is, it's a group of activists who does national advocacy for colored people, right? Ida's commitment to justice was limited to domestic issues. She took to the fight to equal a global stage as well. In a broader scope of history, Ida, her work really laid the foundation for much of the civil rights activism that would come in the 20th century. Her courage, her writing, her commitment, all of these things would inspire people, right? She exposed injustice. She was a driving force. She showed the world that activism can change the course of history. She was just an amazing woman. She was an amazing woman, and put in a situation that was just many people would have crumbled under, but she stood up. She didn't take no for an answer. She didn't just sit back and complain. She fought with every tool at her disposal: her writing, her voice, and her belief in justice. And Ida B is one of the women that I look up to the most, and also one of the as I was writing this script, because guys, I write these scripts the month before. So I wrote these scripts before everything that went down in the United States. And I have to say that Ida B is one of the women who inspired me to, use my voice and tell their stories and do this. I've always loved history, and even if things weren't the way they were, I would still be telling these women's stories. But now more than ever, it's important for me to use this platform, my voice, my opinions, to speak up so that these voices are not silenced. Because there are people in this world, and I'll say it again, it's not just only in America. There's a lot of problems going on all across the globe, right? I am not an American who thinks it's all about America. Do I think that what's going on in America is scary? Yes, but it's happening in more than just the U.S. This rise of fascism and authoritarianism, and so her story made me realize, maybe my words don't get out to anybody, but you know what? I'm still going to use my voice and use my platform, because once again, these stories are important. These women are important. And it doesn't matter the religion, it doesn't matter the color, it doesn't matter when it happened. All these women's stories play a part and create a thread in the tapestry of world history. So that is why I'm doing this. Alright guys, I know I got a little deep right there, but this is a hard subject, and this is a very important one for me. So that's it for this week, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed Black History Month. I really enjoyed learning more about these women. I knew a lot about some of these, but I learned a lot more. I hope you really enjoyed. I hope you got some good information. I hope it inspired you to go check out these women and kind of see what they're all about. And I really appreciate your guys' time. Make sure you come back. Next week we start Women's History Month, and it's going to be fire. It's going to be fire. Yeah. So, as always, guys, please stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you guys next week.